In April 1906, Marie Curie's husband and closest scientific collaborator, Pierre, was killed instantly when he slipped on a rain-slicked Paris street and was run over by a horse-drawn cart. She was 38 years old, with 2 young daughters, in a country and a scientific establishment that had made it abundantly clear, repeatedly, that it did not consider women capable of serious scientific work. 3 days after the funeral, the University of Paris offered her Pierre's vacated faculty position, making her the first woman ever to teach there in its 600-year history. She accepted, and walked into the lecture hall to deliver the next scheduled lecture in the course, picking up the material precisely where Pierre's notes had left off, without ceremony, without an opening statement about her loss. This single decision, to keep working, immediately and without theatrical pause, turns out to be one of the most consistent threads running through her entire life, long before the loss of her husband and long after it. Marie Curie's entire path to becoming a scientist required working through obstacles that would have stopped most people permanently. Born in Russian-occupied Poland, where universities were closed to women entirely, she attended an illegal underground institution known as the Flying University, secretly conducted in private apartments, risking serious punishment for participating. To fund her sister's medical education first, with the understanding her sister would later help fund her own studies, she worked for years as a governess in difficult, often demeaning conditions, delaying her own education by nearly a decade. When she finally reached Paris to study at the Sorbonne, she lived in such severe poverty that she reportedly fainted from malnutrition at least once, having prioritized her limited funds toward books and tuition over adequate food and heating. None of this was incidental hardships surrounding her achievements. It was the actual substance of how those achievements were produced, sustained, unglamorous endurance through difficulty that never fully let up, well before grief entered the picture at all. What Curie demonstrated, across both the ordinary hardships of her early life and the catastrophic loss of her husband, was a particular relationship to work that closely mirrors a Stoic principle covered earlier in this series, that disciplined action does not require, and should not wait for, the presence of motivation or favorable emotional conditions. She did not return to the lecture hall 3 days after Pierre's death because she felt ready, or because grief had resolved itself, or because the timing felt emotionally appropriate. She returned because the work existed, because it mattered, and because she had built, over many years of hardship, a relationship to discipline that did not depend on her internal state matching the demands of the moment. This is precisely the distinction Aristotle and the Stoics drew between discipline as a feeling you wait for, and discipline as an action you simply take, repeatedly, regardless of feeling. Curie's grief was, by every account, severe and lasting, documented extensively in her private diary, where she addressed entries directly to her dead husband for years afterward. The grief was real and it did not disappear. What changed was that she did not allow its presence to indefinitely postpone the work she considered meaningful. Curie's scientific career unfolded inside an establishment that, for most of her life, treated her achievements with a mixture of grudging acknowledgement and open hostility. The French Academy of Sciences rejected her application for membership in 1911 by a narrow margin, in a vote that was reported at the time to be influenced significantly by the fact of her gender, despite her already having won a Nobel Prize. In that same year, a French newspaper, separately, ran a sensationalized and largely fabricated story about her personal life, prompting public hostility severe enough that a crowd reportedly gathered outside her home. In the midst of this exact controversy, the announcement arrived that she had won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, becoming the first person in history, of any gender, to win the award in 2 different scientific fields. She nearly declined to travel to Stockholm to accept it in person, not out of indifference to the honor, but out of sheer exhaustion from the surrounding public hostility. The Nobel Committee encouraged her to come regardless, separating the prize entirely from the unrelated personal controversy. What this period demonstrates is a capacity to continue producing serious, sustained work while substantial parts of the public and scientific establishment were actively hostile toward her, a real-world test of the Stoic instruction to focus on what is within your control, the quality and integrity of your own work, rather than on the opinions of others, which were never within her control to begin with. There is no strong documented evidence that Marie Curie studied Stoic philosophy directly the way Stockdale or Bruce Lee did. Her intellectual formation was scientific rather than philosophical, shaped by physics and chemistry rather than by Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. What makes her relevant to this series, in the same way Roosevelt is relevant despite a less direct connection, is the degree to which her actual conduct, examined across decades, embodies Stoic principles she may never have encountered in their original philosophical form. The dichotomy of control, applied to both grief and public hostility. Discipline understood as repeated action rather than a feeling to be waited for. An indifference to external validation that was not coldness. Her private writing reveals enormous depth of feeling, but a disciplined refusal to let that validation, or its absence, determine whether the work continued. She is evidence, alongside Roosevelt, that these principles surface independently, in serious people, across wildly different fields and historical contexts, whenever sustained achievement under real difficulty becomes necessary. Here's something to try this week, drawn directly from Curie's example. Identify one piece of meaningful work you have been postponing, waiting for a feeling, readiness, motivation, or more favorable emotional circumstances to arrive first. It does not need to compare to her loss or her hardship. The mechanism is the same regardless of scale. Choose one small, concrete action toward that work today. Perform specifically without waiting for the feeling to show up first. Notice that this is uncomfortable, and notice that it is possible anyway. Curie's diary entries to her dead husband continued for years after his death, evidence that the grief itself was never resolved or moved past in any simple sense. The work continued alongside the grief, not after it, not instead of it, but in parallel with it, because she had built, over a difficult lifetime, a relationship to discipline sturdy enough to hold both at once. She died in 1934, having fundamentally reshaped multiple fields of science, her notebooks still radioactive today, still kept in lead-lined boxes, a fairly literal testament to the lasting nature of what she built. Next week, we'll look at another figure whose discipline was tested over decades of isolation few people would willingly choose. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.